This is the art of Startup War, and my name is Brian McMahon, your host and sensei. Here is what we know. 98% of startups will fail every single day, and mostly due to reasons outside your control. The Expert Dojo Startup Accelerator, we look to even up the playing field by sitting down with the greatest minds in startup investment, right here in our studio in Silicon Beach, where we look to shine a light on your path to success. Now, our guests each week have invested millions of dollars into startups and are the most respected investors in the world. Now, they share all they know with you, the listener. So join us on Tuesday mornings at 10 o'clock Pacific Standard Time, starting off your week winning the war against startup failure. Welcome back. It's another week. It's another podcast. You got Brian here from Expert Dojo. I got my very good buddy Alex. We go back. How far do we go back? Ages, right? Almost like one of the original investor festivals. And Alex came down from Santa Barbara. Said, "I want to help you." Now, I got to say, so a couple of things which I adore about Alex, and I'm going to bring him in. He's just a very nice person. He's a good human being, and he really cares about early stage startups, which is great. Number two, he has massive domain expertise within the hardware space, which is unbelievably difficult to find. And it almost seems like every single hardware startup that we come across or meet, they all run over budget because it's so incredibly complicated. And thirdly, right from the very beginning, he's been supporting us in the most difficult stage of startup, which is those startups looking for like 25, 50K. And Alex is like friggin' clockwork. When you see a company you love, you invest. You're one shot, one kill. Welcome.
Thank you, Brian. Pleasure to be here. Always glad to drive down here and to be a part of this. I have enjoyed the Expert Dojo community for many years, and thanks to you, it's here and it's thriving. And that's great to see.
It's good. And I love that you drive down. Who drives down from Santa Barbara? You must be insane. And this isn't your first time driving down here. Was this like the third time in a week and a half?
About that much. Yeah. Highway 1 is nice, though.
Listen, I want to know your story. Because I know where you are now, which is a massive supporter of startups. And as you continually come in, you continually invest in the startups. And I want to get to the type of startups that you love and what drives you to putting those investments in. But before that, I just want to know a little bit about you.
Right. So about 23 years ago, I came here from Russia, of all places. Went to UC Santa Barbara. But always wanted to do projects, and I have always tried to upend something or another back in my younger years.
Yeah.
So right around 2000, that's when I got involved into the first startup that I did. And it's been pretty much continuous from there. I can't say it was all success. On the first two startups, I've learned a couple of very hard lessons, got a lot of interesting experience. One of my projects devolved into a very long, very, very expensive IP litigation that went all the way up to the federal courts and all the way up to Washington, D.C. Learned a lot about that. And then
it's just that this is the only place you never want to be, right?
Right, yeah. That was extremely educational, and I have learned everything that I know about how to patent things, about the IP, about everything else from that experience.
What was your learn for what you would do? Not necessarily what happened, because that doesn't matter, but what was your learn for what is vitally important for you to do if you could do it again?
Right. The first two startups were really learning. And I learned two main lessons, really. Some of it is obvious, just about the quality of the team and knowing that there are three no's that I'm looking for, which I don't tolerate, which is no bullshit, no ego, and no mismatch within the team. The team dynamics have to be in unison from the day one.
What does that mean?
That means that it's pretty obvious when you have a bad team. It may be unqualified, it may be incomplete, there may be something that's wrong. Those are pretty easy to find out what those are. The ones that are harder to find out is if all the individuals on the team have great resumes, they've done it before, and it looks on paper really, really good, but they don't jive together. They either have different motivations, or they have egos in it, or something that's in it that makes them not run together.
Yeah.
And I find that it's incredibly tough to figure that out, because when you look at the deck, they look awesome.
Right.
The people look like they should be able to go to the moon next year.
Yeah.
But when you start engaging with them, you start to realize that, oops, this is not quite right. And then fixing it is always messy. It's always hard. Trying to convince the founder team that one of them doesn't belong here, for instance, is just always an incredibly painful experience. So that, and just the basics, knowing about corporate governance is very important. Having somebody experienced in there and underexperienced, I don't mean necessarily a lawyer. I mean somebody who has done it before.
Yeah.
Is hugely invaluable. And learning about IP, learning about just all of the different dynamics that come from general experience.
And IP is intellectual property.
IP is intellectual property, and knowing when it matters and when it doesn't matter. Because if you go to an IP lawyer, they'll tell you, oh, yeah, very important, patent everything. But that's not really the case. Sometimes it makes sense to do it. Sometimes you lose valuable time to market and very valuable early money while doing that.
Is there a rule on software versus hardware for IP?
There's not a rule. The big change in the IP happened a few years ago with America Invents Act, which is, as far as I see it, an unfortunate change for small startups.
Right.
Which is a change to first to file. And that really created a problematic environment, I think, for IP with small startups. First to file means that it doesn't matter when something was invented. It matters when it was filed.
That sucks.
Prior to that, the system was you could file years later as long as you could prove that it was invented at certain time.
Right.
And you would have that priority. So you could try 20 things, figure out which 19 don't work, and then the one that does work, you could patent it 5 years later.
Yeah, I gotcha. I'm guessing pretty big lobbyist groups managed to get that passed.
That and harmonization with the rest of the world.
Right.
Because Europe primarily runs on that kind of system, and Asia does too. And so it was ostensibly done under the guise of harmonization, but smaller inventors were definitely not heard in that process. So that changed the landscape on IP. To the point where I think that every CTO these days, and there's a whole other subject that I can go on, which is care and feeding of CTOs.
Yeah.
Every CTO needs to know how to write a pretty solid patent application. It doesn't have to be final with claims and everything else, but pretty solid. Without that, it's a crapshoot. It may or may not work out. It may be not a problem because there's not a problem, or it may become a big problem later on. This goes into some of the expertise that goes into supporting early stage hardware startups. That's one of the big areas.
Mate,
there.
This is huge. And we don't actually talk about this at all on the podcast. It might be the first time it's come up. So, look, message to all of you entrepreneurs out there, whether you're starting a business or you have a business, just look at what you have, see how patentable it is, make the inquiries, make sure you surround yourself with great advisors who actually help you get to that place. Because there's a lot of stories of founders who've lost it all, right?
There are stories of founders who've lost it all. There are stories of founders who got stuck. And also, just getting a good patent lawyer is really not sufficient. Not to mention the fact that there are usually two kinds of patent lawyers. They're usually the ones that bust patents, and there are the ones that write patents. And you would want to have the type of lawyer that has done both, or have two lawyers that have each done each one of them. So that's a whole subject where there is... I don't think it takes a lot of time to do it right initially, but it takes a concentrated attention to understand what the situation is.
No, it's
that
good.
You're in.
It's really important. So then,
and I wouldn't go out spending lots of money on that. That's not what I'm advocating here. I'm just advocating being aware of what the issues are, being very cool-headed about it, and taking it from there.
Know where you stand. So when did you strike lucky? So first two, good lessons.
Good
you
lessons,
get into number
some
three.
money, right?
Yeah.
Some money. So And then it kind of went from there. So I didn't have a huge exit of any sort.
Yeah.
I built up what I have by combinations of projects, good investments here. Most of the ones that I've had took a really long time. So some of the stuff that exited, for instance, last year, I put the money in 2007. That's how long it's been in there.
Yeah.
Welcome to the hardware world.
And why do you love hardware so much?
It's not that I do other things as well. So
it's land of the brave. I know you do a
yes,
lot of mobile and
I do. Yeah. So my other specialties include wireless communications of all sorts, which is hardware-ish. It does involve hardware, but doesn't have to involve hardware. I have invested and participated in a couple of medical device projects as well, and I'm also very interested in fintech and crypto. So hardware is not the only thing. I just see a big opportunity in hardware because it's misunderstood, and right now hardware money is incredibly hard to find. Therefore, I see a lot of ideas die, a lot of good ideas die. So I just look at it and say, well, first of all, A, I know it. B, there's just a lot of, I think there's a lot of money to be made there. Both.
And I think you're right. I think a lot of investors, a lot of VCs especially, kind of see hardware the same way that they see virtual reality. They just can't quantify the distance that it will take or the amount that it will take to get there. So they sit on the sidelines with otherwise great projects, right?
Right, and they're right in the sense that the team oftentimes doesn't know what it takes. So the team that's running it doesn't know what it takes. You have to have a team that has all the boxes checked off on a hardware project. If you don't have one of them checked off, it could be trouble. For instance, you could have a team that has great domain expertise, knows about IP, everything that I've just said, got it all sorted out. IP, domain expertise, marketing, pre-sold product, but doesn't know how to manufacture things overseas. That could mean a very significant disaster from just lacking one key competence on the team. So as a result of these years, I have now, with a few like-minded individuals, we have started a new outfit called the Toy Factory. But the whole idea being that we hope that it will grow into a forum where the investors get better understanding of how to invest in hardware and what it takes to make a successful hardware project or product. And the same thing applies to the projects themselves. So offering them support in some of those key areas that they often lack.
I like that. No, I really like it. You're almost like a think tank or a do tank for hardware startups and investors, so everybody gets a greater education of actually what success can look like.
Yes, it's not about just pitch, fund. Certainly there will be pitching, and certainly there will be funding.
Yeah.
But it's about building a better understanding of how to make it work, because there's a lot of money to be made in here. If you look at some of the industries or some of the products, I literally see companies selling the same stuff for 20 years.
Yeah.
They have made enormous amounts of money off it, just absolutely enormous amounts. And you look at this and you say, okay, so somebody's got something right. Sometimes it's luck, sometimes it isn't. And how do we build this? Because hardware is incredibly sticky. For instance, in case of wireless hardware, if you get a wireless device approved through all the carriers and all the other things, if it's a cellular device, and if it gets installed in the field into a decent number of installations, it's a 20-year thing. That same piece of hardware will be sold for the next 20 years for maintenance and repairs, expansions. There's an infrastructure on the ground. There people know how to get it installed. So compare that to a software service that might have, without a significant update, might have a lifespan of 2 or 3 years, maybe. A piece of hardware that's good, that has been designed, that's been out there. A consumer market is a little bit different. Industrial market is wonderful in those ways. You get literally a 10 to 15-year run with one product.
I mean, hell, the paperclip did pretty good, right?
Right.
For all these years. I love that we're talking about hardware here. Just on that point, if you were going to say the greatest attributes for a company to have the top potential of success, and maybe the, again, top areas that they should avoid for failure, what would you list them as?
In hardware.
In hardware.
I would start with having an absolutely kick-ass engineering team is a must. Doesn't
Okay.
have to be a large team, but there have to be a few people that are absolutely top-notch. There's no room for mediocrity in there. The other thing I hate to say it is money. Founders, uh, at least a few of them, have to have a little bit of extra money.
Yeah.
Oftentimes that
Like
comes
how
in,
much is a little bit?
I would say $50,000 or something like that, just so that the very initial stages of the project can happen without having to spend time to raise $20,000.
Right. Okay.
Just to be able to build some initial prototypes, being able to play
Yeah.
without having the pressure of we have to deliver this next day.
Yeah.
Because
Even if you're doing a Kickstarter, we don't
even
care, right? You still need
we, s-
25, 50K for your marketing and your prototyping and your videoing
yes,
and everything else. Okay.
right, just to play with it.
Yeah.
That seems to be one of the key things that that leads to success in my experience. Oftentimes, the founders who found hardware projects, they have consulting companies going on that make ongoing consulting income, and they can siphon a little bit of it off towards a project.
Hmm.
Those are the types of things that create a good environment for spinning off hardware projects. Generally speaking, design consulting companies that do product development for others are really good ground for that.
Yeah.
This is one of the reasons why we're trying to create a more formal organization, is to bring some of those companies in. I'm sure they have ideas. I'm sure they're looking at products that their customers are designing and scratching their heads and saying, yes, okay, this works here, but we see another use for this kind of technology over here, or something like that. It's the people who spend their days in and out thinking about those things. Those are the people that have some of the more interesting ideas sometimes.
Hmm.
So that's number one. Number two is the exact opposite, and that is to have somebody on the team who has invested preferably themselves. And that's good for any startup team, to have somebody who has been on both sides of the fence, so to speak, who has sold both projects and who has sold money, which is what
Yeah.
we do as angel investors. We sell money.
So have an actively engaged investor in the team.
Yes, having that investor doesn't have to invest in this specific project.
Hmm.
That matters less.
Yeah.
But having somebody who can cross onto the other side and who can get the team on the right page, that's going to save a lot of time. Just understanding why angel investors are looking for 10x, 20x returns. It's because that's what's necessary given the failure rate of super early investments,
Yeah.
etc. Getting all that stuff sorted out would help a lot. And also not being afraid to kill the idea early if it's wrong.
Because it gets really expensive afterwards. And actually, to that point, a lot of people feel that just going on a Kickstarter or an Indiegogo is the solution to all their problems. In many cases, doing a Kickstarter or an Indiegogo campaign actually causes more cash flow problems than you had before you started, right? Because you now have these orders that you have to fulfill in a manufacturing process which is not even necessarily laid out yet.
Yes, being very cognizant of that is very important. I call the worst possible volume to have to ship something is in between 1,000 and 5,000 units. In between 1,000 and 3,000 is absolutely dreadful.
Hell, yeah.
It's large enough that if it doesn't work right, it's going to be the end. Yet it's small enough that going to a contract manufacturer that's doing real volumes is not an option. It'll be expensive. It'll be very, very, very painful to do that. Going up to even 10,000, 20,000 is still very difficult for those same reasons. It's much better, though, because one can go to a contract manufacturer, and that's generally the volumes that they will start taking you seriously with, 10
Right.
or 10 or 20,000 units. But going to Kickstarter prematurely is one of the things that I see all the time. There's some campaigns that I have backed. I've backed many over the years, but I've watched a few really struggle for a long time. And then they get into the bad PR territory where all the angry backers are piling up on them on Kickstarter or Indiegogo. And I've actually gone in and I've said that, look, what these people are trying to do is the R&D for this type of product is, let's say, north of $500,000. Their entire sales on Indiegogo are maybe $1 million. Are they going to get it done? Hopefully they're going to get it done. But if they do get it done and they start shipping your product, that's a wonderful thing. And you got your product for a killer deal, and hopefully you feel good about having co-created something. That's great. But Kickstarter volumes really do create significant problems.
No, I remember the coolest cooler.
The coolest cooler was a bona fide example.
Oh, it was painful. It's painful to even think about what those poor guys went through.
Yes, but I understand exactly why they did it. I understand exactly why they had to do what they had to do, because they were running out of cash. They had to...
How much did they raise? Like $12, $13 million or something ridiculous?
I don't remember what they raised. I'm sure that something might have played the role in terms of how they did their engineering and how they did their initial cost accounting, but also...
And they made a mistake, right? They got the pricing wrong. They thought it was going to cost
Right.
30 or 40% less to manufacture,
Right.
and then they put their price on Kickstarter or Indiegogo, or maybe both of them, at the wrong price, under their cost price.
Under their cost price, and trying to get a large number of customers. This happens all the time, and I guess it's a part of Kickstarter and Indiegogo experience. But I now know of more than 2 startups that are in that in-between stage where they're struggling to ship their backer orders only because they have a cash flow problem, and fundamentally they don't really have any problem. They have a product, they have a market, they have it validated, they know what now to price it at correctly and how to sell it. They also know that, because if you run $1 million crowdfunding campaign, crowd sales campaign, you have figured something right. Yet it's very hard for those companies to get funding, any kind of funding. They're stuck in the in-between zone where they cannot prove that they have very large market traction for a huge venture return. They don't have enough ongoing sales to get a line of credit from the bank. It gets very interesting. So I would urge, as a public service announcement for all the Kickstarter backers, if a company is shipping product and if it looks like it's a good product, they will hopefully get to you. But understanding what they're going through, trying to keep the production line running, trying to keep improving their product, and trying to keep the shipping going, that's very tough.
It's hard. Do
It's
you
very
have any
tough.
investment advice for any of these startups? Because it's hard. Because Kickstarter is difficult. Just again, sticking with hardware. I know we're monopolizing hardware, but I do think it's the hardest space right now. It's the best, most lucratively, potentially awesome space. Like take Beats headphones. How quickly do they become a $1 billion company with the right promotion, the right showcasing,
Right.
right investment, and right structure? So we know these products can become amazing, but it's really hard to get it through for investment.
It is really hard to get it through. And general investment advice, I don't think there's a general investment advice. Honestly, I cannot come up with anything that would be this is the special thing that needs to be done. I think in every case, it's looking for those really special opportunities that might arise, whether it's a partnership with a retailer or a partnership with a celebrity or a connection with somebody. There's no generic recipe that I know of. There are some things that generally help, which is not over designing, but designing a solid product. Obviously, that's very important. Making sure that all the things that we've mentioned earlier that I've touched upon, having a good supply chain, knowing your cost structure, and having the right experience in the team, all that stuff helps. And hopefully by combination all of that, the mistakes are avoided, the expensive mistakes are avoided. And once the expensive mistakes are avoided, then hopefully it's a great product that catches on.
Yeah, and I like the fact that you've said about showcasing as well. And there is sometimes an influencer play in there too, where we look to see how can we propel our volume out just a little bit by taking a little bit of unfair advantage.
Yes, absolutely. Unfair advantage is good. And also being very clear whether the product is in the consumer market or in the enterprise/industrial/business market. different problems on both one of them. On the consumer side, the good thing is your sales cycle is short. You can go out onto a crowdfunding campaign and run a crowdfunding campaign in a matter of probably with setup and with campaign execution, let's say 6 months
Mm.
from the start to the finish. You can do that in the consumer marketplace with a consumer product. That's the big advantage. There's no way you could raise similar amount of money through enterprise sales uh, in a similar amount of time.
Yeah.
There's no way. Typically, enterprise sales, most successful products that I have seen that have broken into the enterprise space, they have had somehow the benefit of the first good customer. Whether that happened because of the previous work of the founders, whether that happened because they were able to sell the idea to some enterprise player again because of some previous connections or because it was so good, something, or they gave somebody a very special deal. It might be a custom product that they've sold to somebody, but they've always said, okay, we're going to build a generic product out of it. That's a very common route. So one of those things to get the initial traction going in the enterprise market is a very big deal. It's very hard to just break in from nothing because the sales cycle is 2 years, sometimes a year to 2 years. But
So maybe they just reach out for people like you. I mean, because there are a lot of experienced people who know what they're doing within that space, where they see the potential of the product, and you've invested in hardware companies yourself.
very much
And
so.
put it through.
Yeah.
So how do they go about that route of finding just lots of Alexes who you tick like a gazillion boxes? You tick the box of A, being able to give them some financial assistance, B, being able to give them strategic advice, and C, and many times I've seen you get your hands dirty and actually get in there with the company and help them achieve what they need to by giving a little bit of push from behind.
Yes, I wish there was more of me. I wish I could be cloned.
Yeah.
That happens about every week.
Hmm.
And well, we're building a community of people like me who have a little bit of spare money, a little bit of spare bandwidth, getting this thing off the ground, and hopefully that effort will result in an ecosystem here in Southern California that creates a really open but very honest hardware and hardware related really startup ecosystem. I would even say that in my mind, pure hardware play is great and fun, but of course the more interesting projects are on the boundary of hardware with something else, whether that's hardware with a mobile app, whether it's hardware with crypto, whether it's hardware with some experience component to it. Those are the ones that can leverage multiple ways of engaging with their audience together with each other and against each other in various ways that seems to create a lot more value. For instance, Oculus is a very good example. What is Oculus? Well, yes, Oculus has that hardware, but also Oculus is a content company essentially, and the combination of the two is, well, obviously very valuable.
And the hardware on its own will be less and less valuable as time goes on, and everybody copies what they have. But it's the content that becomes the gold, because that can't be copied because they're continually going forward. It's a little bit like Netflix. They need the hardware for Netflix to be in many places, whether it's Apple TV or whether it's anything else. But it's the continual content that keeps them ahead of everybody else.
It's the continual content. There's a very interesting comparison between Netflix and Disney. They're both worth, I'm not sure, I haven't checked today, but they're both worth about the same amount, I believe. One was north of 150 million. I think it was Disney was a little over 150 million a couple of weeks ago, and Netflix was a little bit less than that. I don't remember the exact numbers of employees, but Disney has somewhere on the order of 50,000 employees, I believe. And Netflix has about 1/10 of that.
Right.
And their market cap is about the same. So the market cap per employee varies accordingly, 10x.
Yeah.
And that's because of the power of the content and not having to have physical things. So sometimes those are the things that the investors look at and say, oh yeah, well, the software company is much better than a hardware company. Just look at Netflix versus Disney, but also understanding that Disney wouldn't be where they are without the hardware component at
Yeah.
all. And Netflix initially had a hardware component. They were shipping DVDs in the mail. So that's whenever that's brought up to me, I just point that at the roots of both companies was a combination of a hardware and a content play at both of them.
You bring up. And these are all really, please, as you're listening to these podcasts, there's normally 4 or 5 huge nuggets that you take out which would be of value to your company. Obviously, Alex spoke about the value of the team, making sure there's a strong engineering component. Don't be just a great biz dev, CEO, trying to build a great hardware product and outsourcing it to the Ukraine or to China. That's not going to work. Also making sure that your not just your supply chain logistics, but your cash flow logistics is rock solid. Be so careful. So many great founders with great ideas, great strategies, great foundations, and great products go bust. They have nothing left just because the cash flow logistics was not right. And now be a little bit different. So rather than just being a hardware company, which is something where you're a little bit defensible, but you don't have anything with it, always be thinking, how can I add on additional elements that will make me stand out from a very busy crowd of other people within the hardware space? You want your investors to be able to tell exactly why you're going to be the one. You're going to be the hardware that's going to break through as opposed to anyone else. And I'll add one other one in there as well, which is just what you mentioned about not just the community you're building, but the people who will generally invest in hardware are more or less people who understand hardware, right? It's very seldom a pure app guy who has no idea about hardware will invest in hardware. They probably will.
Later stage, maybe.
Yeah.
Later stage, maybe, but not early stage.
Early stage is too risky because you just don't know enough. So surround yourself with the types of people who are exactly like you. They're the people who love your space. They love the hardware space. They're either thought leaders in that space, in which case you want them endorsing you and saying that you have a great product, or they're high-level leaders within the space, in which case you want them telling other people about your product as well. But immerse yourself there, right?
One more very important note, and that note I'll just be quick about it, which is about the CTOs.
Yeah.
I have seen this over and over again. You have a founder who is more of an executive type, maybe has some idea. This is true really for any tech company, but especially true in case of the hardware company, where the CTO first of all has to be very, very good at what they're doing, at actual engineering. But second of all, taking care of that CTO is very important. The CTO is not the VP of engineering. The VP of engineering is the guy who makes things happen. The CTO is a level peer with any other C-level officer, CEO or CFO. And if they are treated like just a senior engineer or a VP of engineering, or if they're not capable of really hitting at the CTO level, they have to operate at the senior C level. They have to be from the day one concerned about things like the culture and the company direction. They have to understand business. So if you are running a hardware company and you have a really, really good engineer who is doing your work right now, who you think is your CTO, it's very important to make sure that you truly have a CTO in place. And if you do, then you treat them like a CTO, that any significant business decision they're brought in and they're treated like an equal peer with the CEO or any other board members, chairman, whatever there may be. I have seen way too many companies not do that right and get into medium-term tactical trouble as a result of that, whether the CTO was not a real CTO or whether they were not allowed to be the real CTO. So that's one last. Speaking of nuggets,
pedigree.
Yeah,
pedigree. Make sure that your CTO is the real deal.
Yep.
And they understand what they're doing within this. Now, normally I'd reach back into maybe a time of a difficult time. Doesn't have to be a train wreck, but a difficult time, and take some nuggets from that. I think you provided that beautifully with the intellectual property. Very few people speak about that, and I love that you brought it up. So I'm delighted with that there. We've also talked through the individual aspects that help a company become more successful and avoid the ones that don't, which I like to. Let me hit you with some quick fire questions, which I would love to know. Firstly, biggest success ever cannot be kids. cannot be family.
Biggest success ever is not letting my art background go. So I don't have an engineering degree, even though I do a lot of engineering work. And getting my dramatic art degree back in the day and not letting that drop completely was by far, I think, the biggest accomplishment that I've ever done. Despite having 2 startups at the same time, I managed to get a dramatic art degree after 5.5 years of college. And yeah, that was...
Why was that so important to you?
I always felt that that the brightest people get bored. And I do get bored from time to time. And having something else that you're really good at, in addition to your main line of work, personally to me is quite essential. That I can go and do something, whatever that may be. I sometimes help produce shows and so on and so forth. I get involved when I can, which is not very often. But keeping that, I think was the biggest success, because it was so easy to just let that go 100%. So
it's also really important for entrepreneurs as well. I mean, we can be so immersed into what we're doing on a daily basis inside our own roles, our own jobs, our own companies, and what we're doing to change in the world. It can be unhealthy, right?
Yeah, I would also lead to that certain types of art, especially, I think dramatic art and stage arts are probably the closest to that. They necessarily lead one into the land of self-inquiry.
Yeah.
And understanding what it is that runs, I guess, the darker parts of one's mind. Remember that 90% of the brain is the subconscious brain.
Right.
Only 10% is conscious. I think self-inquiry leads to more clarity.
Right.
And more clarity leads to much better decisions, and that leads to success. So if I would attribute anything to being more clear as the years go on, is self-inquiry, understanding why I thought certain things, and then figuring out whether that's helpful to think like that anymore.
I like that. It makes a huge amount of sense. Yeah, it's very true. Yes, it's very true. Best advice you ever received?
Don't be afraid to say no.
Don't be afraid to say no to... That's really nice, actually. So you're saying in general, and is this more of an LA thing, or is it a world thing?
No, definitely not an LA thing. Just, I think we're all conditioned to like the word yes.
Yeah, to not want to upset people.
Right. Well, it's not just not to upset. I think it's deeper than that. Going back to the question of subconscious patterns, children are taught to behave well, to please parents or others, or even other children. So we're all a little bit addicted to yes.
Right.
And sometimes no is the most constructive thing. No, not in a sense of go bug off. No, in a sense of, no, this isn't good.
Let's not waste any more time on this.
Or maybe it's not good enough. Maybe let's go spend a whole bunch more time, but it's not ready.
Yeah.
Knowing when things are not ready, knowing when it's something that's not right for some other reason, just saying no, and also being sometimes willing to walk away from invested money. It's also a form of a no.
If it's the wrong invested money.
If it's the wrong thing. So I think that's by far the best advice, and I'm still learning how to properly follow it, honestly.
Yeah, and it's easier said than done. I mean,
absolutely.
We had a deal recently which was right at the end, and the entrepreneurs themselves felt that it would be the wrong decision for them, and they said no, literally in the last 24 hours.
Yes, and no doesn't mean adversity. No can be said, as I say sometimes, with humility and love, but it's a no nonetheless.
Yeah, very, very, very important. Entrepreneur you admire the most?
Oh, that's a tough one.
Can be somebody from your cohort, one of the companies that you invested in.
I would give this answer. I admire a certain type of an entrepreneur. I wouldn't really put a person to it necessarily, because I don't want to advertise certain companies. But I would say that the type of entrepreneur that uh, that is um, that is not afraid to just go and execute things and just go and get things done. So by that standard, for instance, I really admire Elon Musk because he just goes out and does things.
Yeah.
Sometimes they're crazy and there are many questions. So I really appreciate people that do things.
Yeah, because at least they bring change,
Whether they will eventually. That's the bottom line.
which always leads to the right change
To
in
the
the
right
end.
change.
But if nobody actually brings the change, it just ends up being an everlasting conversation about what could be, right?
Yeah, I really dislike the entrepreneurs that talk and talk and talk. I really would like to see something done, even if it's a small thing that gets done. I think it's a certain type of a person that just says,
That's a great
we're
point.
going to do it.
Great point. What about a book that you feel would really help an entrepreneur in their journey?
There's no singular book that I can think about. There isn't a book that I read and said, "Aha!" that gave me all of the experience that I needed.
Maybe a person who talks about a subject in a way that you feel is really useful. Could be a podcast host, could be somebody like, for example, I'll tell you who I like, and I don't mention it in the show a lot, but I really like The Prophet, the TV show, if ever you've seen it, where he goes into these businesses and he will always say, look, there's only one of three problems in a business: is people, process, or profit. And if you don't focus on product, I'm sorry, and he'll always focus and try and find out what the problem is. But he gets people, normal entrepreneurs, to look at the show and try and really understand what does it mean to run a successful business. Kind of takes the Shark Tank out of it and brings in a more real life. So for me, every entrepreneur that we have, I love them seeing that show because they learn how to build a real business, and whatever falls off, it's good for them. You any motivators for you like that?
Honestly, I get motivated by art. I get motivated not in a business sense. Let's go write the next year's pro forma invoice. Pro forma financials.
Yeah.
In a way that one thing that happens with really good art is that all the elements that go into it are usually fairly mundane. There is, it could be canvas and a bunch of paint. What's so unusual about that? Could be a bunch of metal into a sculpture, but when you put it together in the right way, magic happens. The same thing happens with people as well. If you put the right people together with the right motivation onto the right thing, then magic happens. So I think the things that motivated me by far the most is just observing that. Whether that comes from the art side, which is easier to find, or when it comes from the startup side, which is harder to find, and it's even harder to be there at the right place at the right time.
We look more like a Picasso, right? In the startup world.
Right.
We got a nose over here, a couple
right.
of eyes around there, and
a few extra arms here and there that need to be removed as soon as possible.
Yeah.
And yeah, so observing that magic, like I wish I could have been there during the early days of, let's say, Google, just as a fly on the wall, seeing that happen. Those are the things that motivate me the most. This is what gets me going.
Because it's abstract. All of our businesses at the beginning are abstract. It is not a complete picture. It's the beginning of a picture. And our objective as we go along is to add piece by piece, color by color, content by content, until we hope to get to a stage, at some stage in the future, where the art comes together, right? I actually really like the analogy.
Yeah, and it's the combination of skill and intuition. You can't do it with just one of them. If it's just skill and no intuition, it's not going to happen. That's very unlikely to happen. If it's just intuition without skill, not going to happen either. So skill and intuition, and it's the same thing that drives really great art.
And entrepreneurs, by the way, if you feel you do not have both, then bring in a partner who does have it. Bring in a complementary skill so you've got it. And look, my last question for you, because we've covered a lot today, is for the rest of this year, we're in 2018, we're halfway through the year, there's a lot of hot things which are happening right now. Where do you see personally, and then as an industry, investment going over the next 6 to 9 months?
Let's see. There's some obvious answers to this, which is in the industries that I'm in the wireless, in the hardware game, anything having to do with 5G connectivity and the next generation of all of that is obviously a huge, huge, huge thing that is going to continue to happen for a long time.
For
It's
sure.
not next year. It's not going to end next year. This is a very big play, and that is going to disrupt an enormous amount of existing industries eventually. So I'm very closely looking at that. Of course, anything having to do with crypto, blockchain, cryptocurrencies, I feel that the golden age is yet to come in terms of projects that are solid, that understand the economics of what they're doing, and really bringing a huge amount of value. So I would definitely be watching those too.
Very good. And in the hardware space?
The hardware space, anything having to do with any kind of wireless technology, that's one, of course. That's having to do with the whole 5G 5G situation. Also, again, by the same token, hardware that is related to anything crypto is going to be very interesting. Other than that,
maybe some AI in there as well, or do you see that in robotics? Do you see that as being a big player now?
I don't. So AI is one of those things where it is not a step function kind of a thing. AI is a constant improvement in data algorithms and everything else. So I view AI as just, it has to be there. It's like, do you have to have computers in cars these days? Yes, you do. Do you have to have some kind of an AI aspect in a product in order to make it better? Is there an opportunity? Absolutely. So AI to me is not one of those things that's nowhere this year and suddenly everywhere the next year. I don't see it that way, but it's obviously a hugely important component. AR, VR is very interesting. I know a few people who will not touch it. I have been careful about it as well.
The augmented reality, which is what you're referring to there, is
virtual
actually
reality and augmented reality. And I believe that the golden time for that is yet to come.
Yeah.
We're not here yet, and I think it has two fundamental problems, which are power and bandwidth. That's what holds everything back. Power and bandwidth. On power, I don't see how we're going to get batteries that have 5 or 10x more power suddenly in the next few years. But bandwidth, going back to my comment on 5G and better wireless networking, that's coming.
Yeah, and it's not far away. We just got to make sure it's coming from here and not from another country, right?
Exactly. Exactly.
Hey, listen, mate, it's a pleasure. It's always a pleasure. Like I said, I can't say enough. You're a close friend of mine. You're a close friend of the dojo. You've always been a great friend for all of our startups here. I even remember the other night when we had our people in here at like 5, 6, 7 o'clock, and you delayed your drive up to Santa Barbara just so you could share advice and help with them. I appreciate everything that you do and all that you are doing to be a part of us. How can people contact you? Should it be either through LinkedIn or should it be through myself, or what's the best way?
LinkedIn works. Alex Kai with 2 A's, Kaay. We have the sign-up page up at toyfactory.io if you are a hardware startup or if you're interested in partnering or investing, really anything. You can contact us through there, and we will get back to you.
Perfect.
So those are the two main ways, and of course, always through Expert Dojo, through Brian. It's always a pleasure to be here. I think that the community that's happening here is absolutely tremendous, and that's why I keep coming back. One of the big reasons. It's always inspiring. It's always interesting. I always end up learning something or meeting somebody. So through Brian, yay, that works.
Thanks, buddy. And that's a wrap.
Thank you.
Thanks for joining us. If you know any other entrepreneur equally ambitious as you, then share this podcast by paying it forward to other entrepreneurs who are building your own army. Now, as always, our website, expertdojo.com, is packed with information to help you grow your business, find investment, and train for victory. We also walk our talk and invest in startups every year in our accelerator here in Silicon Beach. You can always reach out to me at brian@expertdojo.com, And I look forward to being back here again at our regular time next Tuesday, 10 a.m. with another of the world's top investors, helping you win the war against startup failure.